that decade than there were at the beginning of that decade. And just speaking of that decade, I don't really know what to call it. You know, the 2000s, that's kind of hard to say. The zeros or the nils or the nadas, none of that makes sense. So I just turned my grandfather hat for zero with naught. So I'm going to call this the naught decade. And my first impression was that the naught decade for the telephony industry was the decade from hell. And then I started looking at the things that happened in that decade and trying to answer the question. Was it the decade from hell or not? So I'd like to spend a little time today trying to answer that question. I think we could all agree that the telephony industry that existed at the beginning of the naught decade has little resemblance to that existed at the end of the decade. So, at the end of the decade, things were really good. It was a very happy time on Wall Street. Our economy was strong. This industry was healthy and wealthy. Y2K had driven infrastructure upgrades and driven a lot of revenue for the suppliers in this industry. We all survived the clock striking 12 at midnight on Y2K, and the world didn't come to an end, and we were happy about that. Nortel's market cap in 2000 was in excess of $300 billion. Lucid's market cap in the year 2000 was in excess of $250 billion. And it was 2000 that Avaya spun out and created its own separate company. And there were a couple of events that at that time might not have seemed significant to the communications industry, but ultimately turned out to be very significant. The very first version of Cisco Call Manager was introduced. Now, Cisco had acquired Celsius in 1998, and they had marketed their products under the Celsius brand for a year and a half or so, but 2000, the very first introduction of a Cisco-branded call manager. And in Alabama, a little project had been started that at this point was really just an infant because it was less than a year old, but it was the Asterisk open source telephony project. If I compare that to the end of the decade, however, in 2009, it was a pretty scary time. The industry was in turmoil. Our economy was in turmoil. The world economy essentially melted down. And if you compare what the vendor landscape looked like at the end of the decade versus the beginning of the decade, what you would find is that market caps had plummeted, for one, but all these companies that were public at one point, including Avaya, Siemens Enterprise, and Microsoft, had all become private companies. And now, Nortel, at least the enterprise division of Nortel, has become a private company through the acquisition by Avaya, who later today, I suppose, is explaining how they're going to bring those two products to market as a brand. Now, admittedly, Avaya did buy all of Nortel, just to pretend that the enterprise assets were worth a third of Nortel at the beginning of the decade or so. That means what was worth $100 billion at the beginning of the decade was worth less than $1 billion at the end of the decade. So if you were a stockholder there, you saw less than 1% of your value across a relatively short 10-year period. And meanwhile, back in the open source world, Asterisk turned to be open. So if we look at what happened during the decade from a user perspective, I think things are very different today than they were at the beginning of the decade. If you were accustomed to running voice services inside of an enterprise, particularly, then what I think you would say at the end of the decade is that the big iron PBX market is a